The vast emptiness of space stretched endlessly, silent and cold. The Terran defense fleet drifted through the void, their ships like watchful sentinels in the dark. Captain Rourke stood on the bridge of the TDS Valiant, his sharp eyes scanning the data screens. It had been a quiet patrol, too quiet. Then, the silence shattered. A distress signal crackled through the communication channels, faint but urgent. The message was weak, barely holding together, as if sent from a dying system. Rourke leaned in, his pulse quickening as a broken voice pleaded through the static. "Please, anyone out there, we are under attack. Need help, they air." The message cut off. Only silence remained. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Rourke's second in command, Lieutenant Harris, tapped a few buttons, trying to boost the signal. "It's coming from the outer colony Saren 4, Harris reported. "But the transmission is unstable. Looks like interference, or jamming." Rourke frowned. Saren 4 was supposed to be a peaceful colony, far from any major threats. The people there weren't soldiers. They were farmers, engineers, scientists. They had no real defenses. He turned to his communications officer. "Can we get a response?" The officer shook his head. "Signal's gone, sir." It wasn't just cut off. It was silenced. A cold feeling settled in Rourke's gut. He knew what that meant. Someone had wanted to make sure no call for help got out. But it was too late. He had heard it. And if there was one thing humanity never ignored, it was a cry for help. "Set course for Saren 4, he ordered. "Maximum speed." The engines roared to life, and the Valiant surged forward. The rest of the fleet followed, a formation of warships cutting through space like knives. Rourke stood at the front of the bridge, his hands tightening into fists. Minutes passed like hours. The tension in the air grew heavier with every passing second. Then the colony finally came into view. The sight made Rourke's blood run cold. Saren 4 was burning. Massive plumes of smoke curled into the thin atmosphere, rising from shattered buildings and wrecked settlements. Fires raged unchecked. The once thriving colony was now a graveyard of metal and ash. And above it, like carrion birds circling a dying animal, alien warships hovered in silence. Harris's voice was grim. "Scanners confirm. Those ships are XL-FAR." A murmur rippled through the bridge crew. The name sent a chill through even the most battle-hardened soldiers. The XL-FAR were a nightmare species, known for their cruelty, their hunger for conquest. Wherever they went, civilizations disappeared. Rourke's jaw tightened. He had faced them once before, years ago. He had seen what they did to planets, to people. And now, they were here. The XL-FAR ships had not noticed them yet. The fleet was still outside the main sensor range, giving them a few precious moments to assess the situation. Harris studied the readings. There are survivors down there, but not many. Most life signs are concentrated in the colony's underground shelters. He hesitated before adding, "Sir, I ran a voice analysis on the distress call. I think the person who sent it was Dr. Elias." The name struck Rourke like a punch to the chest. Elias had been a close friend, a scientist who had chosen to settle on Saren 4 to study its unique ecosystem. The thought of him trapped down there, hiding while the XL-FAR slaughtered his people, filled Rourke with cold fury. He took a deep breath, pushing emotion aside. This wasn't just about one man. This was about every human still alive on that colony. The crew looked to him, waiting for orders. Rourke's voice was steady, but there was a dangerous edge to it. "We are not leaving anyone behind." A spark of fire lit in the eyes of every soldier in the room. They had all seen what happened to worlds the XL-FAR touched. They had all sworn to never let it happen again. "Prepare for combat," Rourke commanded. "Stealth approach. We hit them fast, hit them hard, and get our people out." The Valiant and her fleet moved forward, engines humming low, weapons charging in silence. The XL-FAR still had no idea death was coming for them. The Deathworlders had heard the cry for help. And now, They were striking back. The TDS Valiant and its fleet drifted closer to Sarin 4, their engines running on silent mode. The colony's burning ruins reflected off the warship's hulls like dying embers, a grim reminder of what had already happened. But this was far from over. Captain Rourke stood at the front of the bridge, his hands gripping the console as he studied the enemy formation. The XL-FAR ships hovered above the planet, dark and motionless, like predators watching their prey struggle before delivering the final blow. "Status on the enemy fleet?" Rourke asked. Lieutenant Harris responded without hesitation. 12 capital ships, unknown number of smaller craft. Their shields are up, but weapons aren't primed. They think they've already won. Rourke's jaw clenched. That was their first mistake. The tactical display flickered as new readings came in. The enemy's ships were positioned in a defensive grid, their formation suggesting they were either waiting for reinforcements or searching for any survivors trying to escape. Rourke's eyes narrowed. The XL-FAR weren't just here to destroy. They were here for something specific. "Life signs?" he asked. Harris's fingers danced over the controls. A second later, red markers appeared on the holographic map. Small clusters of survivors, most in the underground shelters beneath the colony. "But sir, I'm detecting movement." Rourke leaned closer. "Explain." Harris swallowed. "They're being rounded up." The bridge fell into a tense silence. No one needed to ask what that meant. The XL-FAR didn't take prisoners. Not alive, anyway. Rourke exhaled slowly, his mind racing. The fleet could wipe out the enemy in open combat, but the survivors would be caught in the crossfire. A full frontal assault would be too reckless. They needed precision. Speed. He turned to his strike team leader, Commander Vale. "Take a ground team. Get to the survivors before the XL-FAR do." Vale gave a sharp nod. "We'll get them out." "Good. We'll give you cover from up here." As the strike team prepared for deployment, Rourke turned his attention back to the enemy fleet. The XL-FAR still hadn't noticed them. That wouldn't last. A plan was already forming in his mind. Something bold, something they wouldn't expect. "Harris," he said, "I want a full scan of their capital ship. Find me a weakness." The lieutenant hesitated. "Sir, we don't know much about their latest designs. They adapt after every battle." "Then let's show them how humans adapt." A few moments later, the scan results appeared. The XL-FAR command vessel was massive, bristling with weapons, its hull lined with pulsating red energy veins. But no ship was invincible. Harris pointed at a specific point on the hull. "This section here, lower aft quadrant. It's emitting high levels of residual energy. If I had to guess, that's where their shield generators are cycling power. A precise strike could overload them." Rourke smirked. "Perfect." He turned back to the fleet. "Weapons online. I want all targeting systems locked on that point. The moment we fire, they'll know we're here. So we hit hard, hit fast, and break their defenses before they can react." The crew sprang into action. Tension filled the bridge as targeting systems hummed to life, locking onto the enemy ship's weak spot. The moment stretched, heavy with anticipation. Then Rourke gave the order. "Fire." A barrage of plasma beams and missile salvos tore through the void, slamming into the XL-FAR capital ship with devastating force. The explosion ripped through its hull, sending shockwaves across the fleet. The command vessel staggered, its shields flickering, and then failing entirely. The silence of space was broken by the sudden, violent response of the XL-FAR. Their ships scrambled, weapons coming to life as alarms blared through their fleet. They had been caught off guard. Rourke allowed himself a small, satisfied grin. "Now, let's finish this." As the Valiant's fleet surged forward, the Deathworlders struck with the fury of a storm, and the real battle began. The moment the first shot struck the XL-FAR capital ship, the battlefield erupted into chaos. The once still enemy fleet, confident in their victory, suddenly found themselves scrambling to react. The TDS Valiant led the charge, its massive railguns firing molten slugs that punched through enemy hulls like paper. On the bridge, Captain Work stood firm, his sharp gaze locked onto the unfolding battle. His fleet had the element of surprise, but that advantage wouldn't last long. The XL-FAR were ruthless, fast, and adaptive. Given enough time, they would recover, and that could not be allowed. "Stay in formation," Rourke barked. "Keep the pressure on them. I want that command ship disabled before they rally." A series of explosions lit up the darkness as Terran warships engaged the XL-FAR. The enemy vessels, sleek and organic in design, moved with a disturbing fluidity, as if they weren't built, but born. Their weapons flared to life, firing deadly crimson beams that cut through the void with terrifying precision. One of the smaller Terran frigates took a direct hit to its engines, spiraling out of control before vanishing in a fiery explosion. "They're regrouping," Lieutenant Harris called out, scanning the battle data. "Their reinforcements are adjusting formations, trying to surround us." Rourke gritted his teeth. The XL-FAR never panicked. Their war tactics were like a predator's instincts, methodical, precise, and unrelenting. "Not today," Rourke muttered. He turned to his weapons officer. "Bring the disruptor cannons online. Target their formation leader." The Valiant's main cannon powered up, energy surging through its coils. A moment later, the burst of blue light tore through space, slamming into the XL-FAR battleship that had been directing the fleet's movements. The result was immediate. Several enemy ships hesitated, their formation breaking apart for a crucial few seconds. That was all the Deathworlders needed. Terran fighters, sleek and deadly, streaked through the battlefield, weaving between enemy ships with impossible speed. They fired off torpedoes and strafing plasma shots, striking weak points in the XL-FAR hulls. Explosions blossomed like dying stars as enemy ships fell one by one. But the XL-FAR were far from defeated. "Multiple boarding craft incoming," Harris shouted. "They're trying to breach the Valiant." Work's expression hardened. The XL-FAR didn't just destroy. When they could, they infested. Their soldiers, biomechanical nightmares, latched onto ships, burrowing through hulls like parasites, turning once mighty warships into floating tombs. The alarms blared as several XL-FAR pods latched onto the Valiant's hull. The metal groaned as razor-sharp drills began piercing through, cutting open the ship's defenses. "Security teams to breach points," Rourke commanded. "No XL-FAR survives on my ship." Across the decks, armed Terran Marines sprinted toward the impact zones. The moment the enemy hull breach pods completed their cut, the real fight began. The doors to the pods hissed open, and the XL-FAR poured out. They were nightmares given form. Standing over 7 feet tall, their black chitinous armor pulsed with a sickly red glow. Their elongated limbs ended in razor-sharp claws, and their eyeless faces split open into gaping maws, revealing layers of needle-like teeth. They moved unnaturally fast, leaping toward the first humans they saw. The first wave of Marines opened fire, their plasma rifles illuminating the dark corridors with bursts of blue light. The XL-FAR screeched as the rounds tore into them, but they did not stop. They never stopped. One Marine hesitated for half a second, and in that instant, a XL-FAR was on him, claws tearing through his armor like it was paper. Screams filled the comms. The battle aboard the Valiant had begun. In the thick of the fight, Commander Vale led his squad with ruthless efficiency. He moved like a machine, his rifle never missing a shot. One XL-FAR lunged at him, but he ducked, drawing his combat blade and driving it into the creature's throat. Black echers sprayed across his visor, but he didn't slow down. "Hold the line," Vale roared. "Push them back." Despite the XL-FAR's savage strength, the Marines fought harder. They weren't just soldiers, they were Deathworlders. They had evolved on a planet where everything tried to kill them, where only the strongest, smartest, and most ruthless survived. One by one, The XL-FAR began to fall. Back on the bridge, Rourke kept his focus on the battle outside. The Valiant shook violently as enemy fire rained down on them. Hull integrity was holding, but barely. If this dragged on too long, they would be overwhelmed. "We need to take out that command ship before they recover," Rourke said. "Harris, status on our heavy payload." "Loaded and ready, sir," Harris replied. "But we need a clear shot." Rourke's mind worked fast. He glanced at the tactical screen, then made his decision. "All forward batteries, target the enemy escorts. Clear a path for the Valiant." The fleet obeyed. A coordinated wave of firepower lashed out, forcing the XL-FAR warships to pull back. For a brief, crucial moment, an opening formed in the enemy lines. Rourke didn't hesitate. "All power to forward thrusters," he ordered. "Full speed ahead." The Valiant surged forward, engines burning bright as it cut through the chaos of the battle. Enemy ships tried to close in, but the Deathworlders provided covering fire, blasting them apart before they could interfere. The XL-FAR command ship loomed ahead. "Lock onto its core," Rourke commanded. "Fire the Hellfire missile." The Valiant's missile bay opened, and a single massive projectile shot forward, leaving a burning trail behind it. The XL-FAR command ship's defenses tried to react, but it was too late. The missile struck true. A heartbeat of silence. Then the ship detonated in a brilliant explosion that rippled across the battlefield. The force of the blast sent nearby XL-FAR vessels spiraling, their formations crumbling. The once organized fleet was now in complete disarray. A cheer erupted across the Terran fleet. The tide had turned. Rourke exhaled, his grip on the console finally relaxing. He wasn't foolish enough to think this was over, but they had delivered a heavy blow. Now, there was only one mission left. "Commander Vale," he said into the comms, "get our people off that planet." The Deathworlders had struck back, and they weren't done yet. The fires of battle still raged in orbit, but on the surface of Saren 4, the true fight for survival had only just begun. Commander Vale and his strike team moved swiftly through the ruined colony, their footsteps muffled by the ash-covered ground. The air was thick with smoke, the scent of burned metal, and charred earth filling their lungs. What had once been a thriving settlement was now a wasteland of shattered buildings and lifeless streets. "Keep your eyes sharp," Vale whispered over the comms. "The XL-FAR aren't done here." Ahead, through the haze, the entrance to the underground shelters came into view. A reinforced steel hatch lay partially buried under debris, but the distress beacon from inside still flickered weakly. Vale motioned to his team. "Move the wreckage." Quietly. 2 soldiers stepped forward, working quickly to clear the entrance. Every movement sent small clouds of dust spiraling into the dim light. Vale kept his rifle trained on the shadows, scanning for movement. He knew the XL-FAR wouldn't leave survivors unguarded. Finally, the hatch was clear. One of the engineers worked to override the lock, his fingers flying over the control panel. A tense moment passed before the door released with a hiss, revealing a narrow stairwell leading down into darkness. Vale signaled for his team to follow, and they descended. The air grew colder as they moved deeper underground, the silence pressing in from all sides. Then, movement. Vale raised a fist, and his team froze. He switched to thermal vision, his visor lighting up with the telltale signatures of life forms ahead. Some were human, but not all. He switched back to standard vision, just as something moved in the shadows. A low, wet clicking noise echoed through the corridor, followed by the unmistakable rasp of XL-FAR claws scraping against metal. Vale didn't hesitate. "Contact," he barked, raising his weapon. Gunfire erupted in the confined space. The corridor lit up with flashes of blue plasma as the first wave of XL-FAR lunged from the darkness. Their black, insectoid bodies twisted unnaturally as they skittered across the walls and ceiling, their claws slashing through the air. A Marine beside Vale screamed as XL-FAR tackled him, its elongated jaws snapping shut just inches from his face. Veil turned and fired, the plasma bolt punching through the creature's skull. The Marine scrambled back, breathing heavily. "Keep pushing forward," Veil ordered. "We have to reach the civilians." They moved in tight formation, cutting down anything that moved in the darkness. The deeper they went, the thicker the resistance became. It was clear now. The XL-FAR weren't just killing survivors. They were using them for something. Then, as they rounded a corner, they found them. A cluster of civilians, men, women, children, huddled behind a makeshift barricade. Their eyes were wide with terror, their faces gaunt from days without food or water. Among them, standing protectively at the front, was Dr. Elias. Veil recognized him immediately from the mission brief. A scientist, not a soldier, but the determined look in his eyes told Veil that he had fought just as hard to keep these people alive. "We're here to get you out," Veil said, keeping his weapon raised. "Anyone injured?" Dr. Elias nodded grimly. "A few, but they can move. We have to hurry. There's something else down here." Veil's blood ran cold. Define something else. Elias swallowed hard. The XL-FAR. They weren't just attacking. They were digging. Veil's mind raced. The XL-FAR never did anything without a purpose. If they were digging, it wasn't just for destruction. They had been looking for something. Before he could ask more, the ground rumbled beneath them. A deep, guttural sound echoed through the tunnels, a sound that didn't belong to the XL-FAR. It was something older, something vast. Elias paled. They woke it up. The realization hit Veil like a punch to the gut. Whatever that XL-FAR had uncovered, it was still here. And it was waking up. Veil switched to comms. "Captain, we have civilians secured. But there's a problem. The XL-FAR weren't just invading. They were searching for something. And they found it." There was a pause, then Work's voice came through, steady but urgent. "Understood. Get those people topside now. We'll be ready." The ground shook again, harder this time. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and somewhere in the distance, metal twisted and groaned as if an entire section of the tunnels was collapsing. Veil didn't wait. Move. Now. They rushed back the way they came, civilians in tow. The XL-FAR were still out there, but their movements had become erratic, almost fearful. Whatever was down here, even the XL-FAR were afraid of it. As they reached the surface, the true scale of the battle became clear. The Terran fleet was still locked in combat above, but the XL-FAR ships were retreating. Not in a strategic fallback, but in panic. Veil barely had time to process it before a massive explosion rocked the colony. The ground split open, and something began to rise. The Deathworlders had come to rescue their own, but now they had awoken something far worse. The ground split apart with a deafening roar. Chunks of shattered rock and metal debris were hurled into the air as something immense emerged from the depths below. The very planet seemed to tremble as an ancient force, long buried beneath the surface of Saren 4, rose once more. Commander Veil barely had time to push the last of the civilians toward the evacuation zone before the first tendrils of the creature clawed their way into the open air. Thick as starship hulls, covered in jagged black exoskeleton, they twisted and writhed as if tasting the unfamiliar freedom of the surface. "What in the hell?" Veil breathed, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Then it came. A colossal form began to rise from the fissure, its monstrous body dragging itself free from its ancient prison. It was neither insect nor machine, neither wholly organic nor purely synthetic. It was something beyond, something that should not exist. Its head, if it could be called that, was a massive chitinous structure, adorned with bioluminescent markings that pulsed like a heartbeat. Deep within its armored plating, multiple rows of compound eyes gleamed like dying stars. And then it screamed. The sound was not just noise. It was an invasion of the mind. a pulse of raw, ancient hunger that bypassed ears and flesh, sinking directly into the soul. Vale staggered, his vision blurring for a moment. Around him, several civilians collapsed, clutching their heads. Even the XL-FAR, the once unrelenting invaders, fled in terror. That's when Vale realized the truth. The XL-FAR weren't just here to destroy the colony. They were trying to stop this. Vale. Captain Rourke's voice cut through the static. What the hell is happening down there? The XL-FAR fleet is pulling back. Fast. Vale steadied himself, forcing his thoughts into focus. Captain, we have a new problem. The XL-FAR didn't just attack Saren 4. They were digging. They found something buried here, something big. There was silence for a moment before Rourke spoke again, his voice grim. What are we dealing with? Vale turned, watching in horror as the entity pulled itself fully from the pit. Its massive form loomed over the ruins of the colony, blotting out the emergency lights like an eclipse. I don't know, Vale admitted, but the XL-FAR are running from it. That was all Rourke needed to hear. Get everyone out of there. Now. Vale was already moving. All teams, fall back to the dropships. We're evacuating. His squad and the surviving civilians scrambled toward the waiting transports as the creature continued to rise, its massive limbs tearing through buildings like they were nothing more than dried leaves. Then the sky shifted. Vale looked up, expecting to see the distant flashes of battle between the Terran and XL-FAR fleets. But instead, he saw something far worse. The stars were disappearing. One by one, the distant lights of space seemed to wink out, swallowed by something vast and unseen. It wasn't until his visor automatically adjusted for contrast that he saw the true horror. More of them. Not just one, but many. The thing that had awoken on Saren 4 was not alone. Across the sky, other fractures in space itself began to open, cracks in reality, tearing through the fabric of the void. And from within those breaches, shapes moved. Massive, shifting forms. Things with too many limbs, too many eyes, too many voices. The XL-FAR hadn't invaded for conquest. They had come to seal the tomb. And humanity had just opened it. Captain, Vale said, his voice hollow. We didn't just wake something up. He watched as the massive entity unfolded itself, stretching toward the heavens. We invited them in. Rourke's response was immediate. All remaining Terran forces, full retreat. But the creature was not going to let them go easily. With a single sweeping movement, it turned its attention toward the sky. The pulsing markings along its body flared brighter, as if it were calling to something beyond the physical realm. And then, the fleet screamed. Every ship in orbit, from the smallest fighter to the TDS Valiant itself, suddenly shook as if struck by an invisible force. The AI systems flickered, screens glitched, and crew members collapsed as the unnatural psychic pulse tore through them. Vale could hear the voices, 1,000 whispers. No, millions. His own mind burned with it, and he barely managed to stay on his feet. This was not war. This was something older, something cosmic, and humanity had just stepped into its path. Rourke's voice came through the comms again, strained but still in control. All ships, prepare for warp jump. We are leaving. Vale didn't argue. He and his team pushed forward, shoving civilians into the dropships as fast as possible. The massive creature below them began to shift, sensing its prey trying to escape. And then, it spoke. Not in words, not in sound, but in understanding. A voice that was not a voice, a message that did not need translation. It had been asleep for eons. Now it was awake. And it was hungry. The sky tore apart. Vale leaped into the transport as the pilot punched the engines, lifting them into the air. Below, the monstrous entity reached upward, its colossal form pulsing with unnatural energy. But it was too late. The first wave of Terran warp engines activated, and in a burst of light, the human fleet vanished. Saren 4 was left behind, and the darkness was free once more. The stars twisted as the fleet ripped through space at faster-than-light speeds, but even the vastness of the void felt too small now. Something had changed. Commander Vale sat in the dropship's dimly lit cabin, his pulse still hammering from what they had just witnessed. Around him, the rescued civilians sat in silence, their faces pale, their eyes distant. They had escaped, but none of them felt safe. Vale's comms crackled. "Commander, report." It was Captain Rourke. The weight in his voice told Vale that the battle above Saren 4 had only been a prelude to something far worse. Vale exhaled sharply. "Sir, we have a problem. A big one." He hesitated, struggling to find the words. The XL-FAR weren't attacking Saren 4. They were containing something. And we. He clenched his jaw. We let it out. Rourke's response was slow, measured. "I saw the thing. It wasn't alone," Vale said grimly. "There were more of them. I saw fractures opening across the sky. And Captain." He closed his eyes for a second, steadying himself. "It spoke, not in words, not in any way that makes sense. But I felt it." Rourke didn't speak right away. Vale could hear distant voices in the background. Officers running calculations, engineers working at their stations, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Finally, Rourke's voice returned. "Get up to the Valiant as soon as you dock. We need to talk." Vale nodded, even though Rourke couldn't see him. Understood. The transmission cut, and Vale looked back at his squad. Most of them had removed their helmets, sweat clinging to their faces. But their eyes held the same haunted look as his own. They had all heard it. AF lead T in ruins. When Vale finally stepped onto the bridge of the TDS Valiant, the sight outside the viewport made his stomach drop. The fleet was in shambles. Hundreds of ships had made it out of Saren 4's orbit, but not all of them were intact. Some flickered, their power systems failing. Others drifted without control, their hulls scarred by something that hadn't even touched them physically. And then there were the dead ships, floating husks, perfectly intact, yet silent. No comms, no life signs, no damage, just empty. Vale stepped forward. "Captain." Rourke stood at the bridge's central console, arms crossed. His eyes were hard, his jaw clenched. "We lost 20% of the fleet," he said, voice flat, "and another 10% might as well be scrap." Vale swore under his breath. What happened? Rourke turned to face him. The scream. Vale felt a chill creep up his spine. He had felt it. That wave of alien thought, that hunger pressing into his skull. But he had fought through it. Not everyone had. The ships that are still dead in the water. Rourke gestured toward the floating husks outside. Their crews are gone. No trace. No signs of a fight. It's like they were just wiped away. Vale's fists clenched. And the XL-FAR. They're running. Rourke let out a humorless laugh. Their entire fleet broke off and went into deep space. No counterattack, no last stand. Just running. Vale processed that for a moment. The XL-FAR, the species that had waged war against humanity for decades, had abandoned the fight completely. Because even they knew what was coming. Rourke took a deep breath. "We need answers, Vale. And we need them fast." He motioned to the holotable at the center of the bridge. A grainy image flickered into view, a scan of Saren 4's surface before they left. The pit where the creature had risen was still visible, but the fractures in reality that had begun to spread above it, they were still growing. Vale's stomach turned. "Sir, we have to warn High Command." Rourke nodded. "Already sent the first report, but I doubt they'll understand. Hell, I barely understand." Vale's mind was racing. The XL-FAR knew something. They had been desperate enough to fight an unwinnable battle, not against humans, but against whatever they had buried. "Captain," Vale said, I need to talk to the prisoners. Rourke frowned. What prisoners? Vale exhaled. The XL-FAR we captured during the ground fight. We need to find out what they know. The enemy's warning. The holding cells were cold and dimly lit, the reinforced walls pulsing with a faint energy field designed to keep even the strongest aliens contained. Vale stepped inside, his boots echoing against the metal floor. In the center of the room, restrained by heavy energy cuffs, sat a XL-FAR warrior. Its black exoskeleton was covered in scars, its compound eyes gleaming in the low light. It did not struggle, did not speak. It simply watched. Vale approached slowly. You're going to tell me what was buried on Saren 4. The XL-FAR tilted its head slightly, its mandibles clicking once. Then, in perfect human English, it spoke. You are already dead. Vale didn't flinch. I don't believe in ghosts. The XL-FAR laughed. A dry, brittle sound. You do not understand, it said. None of you understand. It leaned forward, its gaze piercing through him. That thing you woke. It is not a creature. Not a species. Vale narrowed his eyes. Then what is it? The XL-FAR's mandibles twitched. It whispered. A warning. The word sent a chill through Vale's entire body. Before he could press further, the XL-FAR looked toward the ceiling. Its mandibles parted slightly, as if listening to something only it could hear. Then, without hesitation, it slammed its own head against the wall. The sickening crack echoed through the room. Vale lunged forward, but it was too late. The XL-FAR slumped forward, lifeless. A silence filled the cell, heavy and suffocating. Vale clenched his fists. Whatever was coming, the enemy feared it so much they would rather die than let humanity understand. He turned toward the guards. Get me everything we have on XL-FAR history. If they knew this was coming, we need to find out why. The answers were out there. And time was running out. The silence in the interrogation room lingered long after the XL-FAR's body had gone still. Commander Vale stared at the lifeless alien, his mind racing. This wasn't just fear. This wasn't just a war. This was something older. Something so terrible that the XL-FAR, one of the most ruthless species humanity had ever encountered, chose death over explanation. Vale exhaled sharply, his hands tightening into fists. They had to move fast. He turned to the guards. Seal this room. No one enters without my authorization. One of the guards hesitated. Sir, shouldn't we? Vale cut him off. Now. The guard nodded and quickly activated the security field. The hum of containment energy filled the air as the doors locked shut. Vale was already moving, heading straight for the bridge. The MESSAG NTHE void. When he arrived, Captain Rourke was already waiting. The holotable displayed a dozen intercepted signals. Encrypted, broken, but urgent. Vale frowned. What are those? Rourke's expression was grim. XL-FAR transmissions. Every remaining warship in their fleet is broadcasting the same message. He tapped the console, and a distorted voice filled the room. Leave the stars. Before it wakes. Before it knows you are here. The translation flickered with static, but the meaning was clear. Vale's jaw tightened. They're trying to warn their own people. Rourke nodded. And they're abandoning every system near Saren 4, every outpost, every colony, every fleet. He looked at Vale. They're running from the entire sector. A cold realization settled over them both. This isn't just about Saren 4, Vale said quietly. It's spreading. Rourke turned back to the holotable. There's more. Another transmission played. This one was different. It wasn't XL-FAR. It was human. A distress signal, barely holding together. The voice was familiar. This is Admiral Carver of the TDS Resolute. The message glitched, breaking apart in bursts of static. The stars are wrong. We tried to leave, but Another burst of interference. Can it see? Cannot escape. Can it? The audio cut abruptly, but the signal remained active. Vale's stomach twisted. The TDS Resolute was one of the largest battleships in the fleet, stationed light years away from Saren 4. Yet, they were already affected. "This thing isn't staying on Saren 4, Vale muttered. "It's reaching beyond." Rourke's expression darkened. "We need to track that signal. Now." The fading light. The Valiant's sensors pinpointed the distress call's location. It wasn't far. Within an hour, the fleet arrived. The moment they dropped out of warp, the bridge fell silent. The TDS Resolute was there, but it was wrong. The massive battleship drifted, intact but utterly dark. No running lights, no comms. Just floating. Vale's gut told him something was watching. Rourke's voice was low. "Scan it." The sensors flickered, struggling to get a read. Then, "Sir," one of the officers whispered, "we're detecting life signs." Vale's pulse quickened. "Survivors." The officer hesitated. "I don't know." Vale and his team suited up. Whatever had happened to the Resolute, they needed answers. The boarding craft approached carefully, docking with the ship's airlock. The moment the doors hissed open, Vale stepped inside. The silence was overwhelming. The hallways were empty. No bodies, no blood. Just rows of weapons left behind, as if the crew had vanished mid-battle. "Stay sharp," Vale muttered. They moved deeper inside. The ship's main systems were offline, but the emergency lights flickered faintly. The deeper they went, the worse the air felt, like the space itself was wrong. Then they reached the command deck. Vale's breath caught. Admiral Carver was there. Or what was left of him. He stood at the center of the bridge, facing away. His uniform was untouched, his posture unnaturally stiff. Vale stepped forward cautiously. "Admiral." Carver's head turned. "Too far." A shudder ran down Vale's spine. Carver's face was untouched. His eyes were open, but they were empty. His lips moved, but the voice didn't come from his mouth. It came from everywhere. "You should not have come." The ship lurched. Every emergency light flared, casting deep shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Vale's squad froze as the air grew heavy. Carver took a step forward, but his body did not move. It was as if something else was wearing him. Vale's instincts screamed, "Fall back." Now, the team turned and ran. As they fled, the ship itself seemed to shrink around them. The hulls twisting, stretching, warping. They barely made it to the boarding craft before the Resolute shifted. The moment they undocked, the ship collapsed inward. It was not destroyed. It was simply gone, as if it had never been there at all. The final transmission. Back on the Valiant, Vale stood on the bridge, his heart still pounding. Rourke was pale. What the hell was that? Vale didn't have an answer. But then, the fleet's long-range sensors triggered an alert. Something was coming. Not from Saren 4. Not from any known sector. From the dark between galaxies. The fractures were not stopping. They were expanding. And something was coming through. The last message from the Resolute echoed in Vale's mind. "The stars are wrong." He looked at Rourke. "This isn't an invasion," Vale said quietly. "This is a harvest." Rourke clenched his fists. "Then we need to warn everyone." Vale's gaze turned to the void beyond the viewport. It was too late for warnings. Something was already here,